Hey there, Smite fans, and welcome in to another edition of the SPL Waiting Room. I'm Aggro. I'll be your host as per usual. And as per usual, we've got a great show lined up for you here today. We've got Graham, Hindu Man Hadfield, and of course, Gormizer joining us here on the Waiting Room a little bit later on. But first, we got to talk about what happened last week. Last week, we had the top 4 teams on Saturday and then the bottom 4 teams on Sunday. And we are left now with only 1-0 in a win-loss column. And that's a United. They're the only team to still be winless in going into week number 5. And we're now left with 0 undefeated teams. I thought, and based on my voting, that we were going to have a showdown of 2 undefeated teams coming in to our opening game this week. But it turns out that both Ghost and Radiance suffered a loss on Saturday. But the big thing that stood out to me so far here in phase number 2 is that it's a little bit different from phase number 1. In the sense that, yes, we've got our top 4 teams and our bottom 4 teams. Those tend to kind of happen in the SPL. But what made phase 1 so exciting was that bottom 4 teams were consistently punching up and playing well and beating top 4 teams. And that just hasn't seemed to happen so far here in phase number 2. Whether that's those new top 4 teams being more accustomed to their new rosters and getting more and more comfortable, whether it's the fact that the meta changing usually tends to favor top-end teams that are already succeeding rather than those that are still trying to catch up on the previous meta, I'm not really sure. I'm hoping, and I think that we will pretty soon see some bottom 4 teams take some games off the top half of the league, but that remains to be seen, I suppose. Maybe week 5 is the magic week for one of those bottom-end teams. Like I said, by the way, Ghost Radiance, the big matchup of the week. I thought they were both going to be undefeated coming into this one, but it still remains our headliner and our opening game of the week and our poll of the week here on the SPL Waiting Room. Get your vote in chat now on who you think is going to win that set. We'll go over it later on in the show when we cover all of the casters' predictions. But for now, you get on to something you hear me talk about last week and what you saw. We've got an actual video for you. As usual, it's Finch and Dave's recap as told by Dave and Finch.
Welcome into another episode of the SPL Weekly Recap for Week 4 with Finch and Dave. Remember, we write these scripts for each other, then read them for the very first time here as part of this broadcast. So I will start things off. This weekend in the SPL would start off with the 2 teams in most desperate need of a win, Obey and E United. And honestly, stakes were somewhat high with both teams walking on eggshells, trying to avoid cracking an ag bet you can't. Ultimately, it would be Obey that swung a couple of times to get the momentum in the phase started to 1.
Well, the second set on Friday seemed a little one-sided on paper, but would end up being a lot closer than expected. Despite the eventual 2-0 scoreline, it always felt like the Renegades can make it right to the finish line, but can't quite cross it. And that's the case here. In both games, Renegades had a lead around the 20-minute mark, and in both games, Radiance end up taking the lead away in one big team fight.
Sanguine came to play, however, and in one of the biggest upsets so far, Game 1 was not all that close. You'd assume I was talking about Ghost, but instead it was Sanguine tanking the early fights with a resurgent Panatom and snowballed the game out of control with the jungle, ADC, and mid leading the charge. Now, Game 2 is a lot closer. Ghosts get out to their traditional fast start, but Sanguine hang in there time and time again. This one was a game of throws, and by the end of it, Sanguine finally are able to crack the Ghost base thanks to some timely dives to the back by Panatom, and suddenly we would be down to one final undefeated team.
This one lived up to the hype with tons of back and forth action. Radiance got out an early lead in the set with Game 1, and they win by pushing Nika's Cthulhu. Then SSG bounced back with Hera, Erlang, Shen combinations in Games 2 and 3, and Radiance never came up with a sufficient answer. SSG will take this set 2-1.
While the Renegades won 2-1, this set maybe raised even more questions than it answered. We can honestly lump all 3 games into one pile here. An absurd amount of fighting led to an early lead, and that early lead snowballed into a 24-ish minute win. Copy-paste 3 times and slap a Renegades logo on games 1 and 3, and there's your set.
Obey had been improving, and PK seemed a little out of sync, but that would all change in a hurry. PK was in control for most of the set, stacking up strong performances from Cuvo Fred and Paul alike. It was close, but in the end, PK did end up finding that 2-0 win. That's week number 4 of Phase 2 of Season 7 of the SPL, as told by Finch and Dave and as written by Dave and Finch. It was a lot of fun to recap. Here's to watching week number 5.
Welcome back, everybody. As I mentioned, we've got Gormizer and Hindu Man joining us on the show this week. And fellas, we've got a lot to talk about because we're pretty close now to every team having played one another. I believe they all will have played each other after this week number 5. But we're starting to see some trends develop among teams and among players. And I think that I want to take a little bit more of an individualistic look at this one. I want to talk about Cyno to start off because chat has been very angry with Cyno at times, normally when he's picking the Warriors. But since going back to the Assassins, I think he has looked a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree. I think Cyno, honestly, overall, his performances for Obey, with how the year's gone so far, have been very, very helpful to Obey's structure and learning as time's gone on. I think the big thing we've seen out of Cyno, and you can see it from some of his tweets as well, if I'm honest, regarding exactly how he's feeling his performances, and they kind of are obvious. He's doing a lot of the donkey work for this team and putting the team on his back, but this is allowing his team to kind of rally behind him a little bit now. I think the one thing that, like, chat's saying about the Warriors, I think the Warriors do work for him. But I do think it's a very specific playstyle to make work in that scenario where he's got to really, have his team rally around him. Otherwise, it can look like a bit of a fish out of water to an extent when he's going in very deep without the support of his team. Cyno's been a big pickup, in my opinion, for Obey this year, and I think we're starting to see headway now with him as we get deeper into Phase 2. I think the United performance and a couple of performances just before that really showed that Cyno, he won a world championship once upon a time, and ever since then he's been not necessarily struggling to find form, but find a team that can work with him. And Obey, who was struggling, have now found this window now to maybe turn it around for themselves off the back of Cyno's work.
I mean, it's kind of funny that I mentioned the Warrior Jungle and that he's moving away from it a bit, but most of the highlights are the Erlong Shen, of course, who is a Warrior. But I think it actually is perfect because I think it goes to show that it just doesn't matter what the class is, right? I mean, it's just the style of God that Cyno is going to excel on. And I agree. I don't know if you feel the same way, though, Hindu, that Erlong Shen, those initiator-type characters, the ones that let Cyno be the spearhead, are going to be the ones that end up being the most successful.
Yeah, completely agree. I think the biggest thing for him to really concern himself with is if he's going to run the Warriors, what is he going to be against in the jungle? Because can he get it off to a good start? Is Nemesis going to be an additional threat? We've talked about Nemesis quite a bit lately. And I think putting Warriors there, the Nem can really cause some issues for those Warriors jungles when it comes to the teamfight stage. But also Cyno's playstyle. For a lot of the time, Cyno likes to engage a fight and then dip out. Wait a while, and then come back in afterwards to clean up some kills once his cooldowns are back. And I think with that sort of playstyle, it can be very inherent of a bonus for him, but also a potential negative if he's not involved in the fight as much.
Now, from the other end of the coin, from a veteran to a rookie, we have GuyJ for United. And Gore, I think GuyJ has had his moments, but he's also had his moments. You know what I'm picking?
Yeah.
You picking up what I'm putting down here? What has been your take on GuyJ's first few weeks in the SPL?
So you could tell, especially if you watch those first 2 weeks that he was picked up, that he was new in the league, right? And it just came with the essence. You've got Snoopy, who's just transitioned over to support. So not only do you have this new carry who's trying to come in with these guys who have already been playing at this level all year, but also you're trying to accommodate a guy who has been carry for years and years and years in the SPL, and now he's playing support. So your entire duo lane is getting revamped, and you could feel that in the first 2 weeks. But then they started picking, well, the guy you're seeing highlights of, Rom. He is literally up there tied with Hercules for the most picked on E United, and it was just the opening to let GuyJ showcase what he can do, because it's a comfort pick. And if you're going to be able to get this for him every time, and since Hunters aren't necessarily banned too often, it's pretty easy to get him on this. I think it's opened him up to improve. Now, if you look at, his KDA, the damage, his GPM, for a lot of it, he was average or in the bottom 4 compared to some of the other hunters in the league. And honestly, that's kind of what you expect when you're on a team like United. They're on a 6-loss streak. You're not going to be able to flourish too much down there. But his improvements over the 4 weeks of play we've already seen, in my eyes, have opened up the door for United to start making those strides forward. I don't think it's going to be an overnight transformation, but by the end of Phase 2, I think this duo lane is going to be something to be worried about. And I think GuyJ is a big chunk of the reason why.
Very well said in my mind. Hindu Man, I also want to talk about a player that I know you love to compliment a whole lot, BigManTings, and for good reason, man. He has been absolutely popping off here in phase number 2. He basically single-handedly won Radiance a game against Renegades earlier.
BigManTings honestly has gone through a very interesting career in my eyes. He started off in the lower leagues of the EU on the sort of Fnatic team as a support player, and I think it's really good credit to this dude as a player about his evolution to moving from a support role all the way to a mid lane player. But his mid lane plays, look at his playstyle. I mean, he's able to play the carries in terms of the hunters as well as the mages too. And as you said, you know, the most recent performance that we saw out of him, pretty much single-handedly on that Merlin caused the rough state of affairs that we saw from Renegades. I think BigManTings' career has continued to escalate, and the funny thing is, when you look at this Radiance roster he's on, aggro, he's around 4 world champions, but yet we're still talking about BigManTings. How wild is that when you think about it? This just shows that this guy has really allowed himself to get into the league, find a staple on a team with really solid members around him, but still flourish. And that shows that his ability to work with team members who are potent, and let's be honest, the Radiance team, they're very much focused on, how can I put this really? I mean, they've all got their own identities, is the best way I can put it, and trying to meld all those identities together is quite tricky. But BMT slips into that role, finds a way to show how good he is, but also support the team. BMT for me is arguably on par for going towards the best mage in the mid lane, the mid lane player, I should say.
He's been playing that way in phase 2. I don't think there's any argument about that. Hinderman brought up identity there, Gormizer. When I think of players with clear identities, AwesomeJake might be at the very top. You are crystal clear on what this guy wants to do basically every single game. How has he done it, though, in phase number 2? Because in my mind, I think he has struggled a little bit in comparison to phase number 1.
Yeah, I think that's actually the interesting thing. With the way the meta shifted, you could tell Jake kind of stutter-stepped coming into Phase 2. Things weren't as easy as just being that guy everyone knew from Ranked anymore. And, you know, honestly, you compare him and maybe the same parallels to where GuyJ is. It's kind of that, well, you're still fresh in the league. You're still trying to catch up to, you know, like the likes of PBM, who statistically is just the best Guardian in the game right now. But he's keeping up with everybody, right? I mean, he's around Raffer, Wrongyu, and Aurora in terms of KDA, and a lot of it was, you know, again, very much, I think, in similarity to GuyJ, playing what you play well, not what is always the best, right? The Ymir is a completely different conversation as you see him show up on the screen, but I mean, you can't argue with a 5-man stun, and that's the thing I think that Jake is bringing into this, right? What he has for Renegades, his identity as a whole, really is the fact that he's not the guy that's going to make the huge flashy plays. That's going to be Lasber. That's going to come out of mid. That's going to come from Bara. But he's almost always the backbone of the Renegades. Every time we see them do well, Jake is having a phenomenal game. In fact, there have been some games where they have only been winning because Jake is doing everything in his power to get them there. And I think that's something that we've gotten to see and flourish. Right now in Phase 2, again, a little bit of a stutter step at the beginning. But now with, you know, your likes of Cerberus and other Guardians kind of picking back up over there in the duo lane, I think he's starting to find his niche once again and can find that spot, and Renegades should be looking better because of it.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good point. The Ymir has been a big pick for Renegades as of late as well, something to watch out for whenever the Cowboys suit up. Now, I want to go away from players and more to the characters that they're playing, because we're seeing a lot of interesting gods really rise in the meta here in phase number 2. And I think a couple of them are going hand in hand here. I want to start with one Nemesis counter, and that's Hebo. Is that the only reason we're seeing him, Gore? Is that he's really good against Nemesis?
Well, see, the thing I love about Hebo is that he brings that counter, just like you just highlighted. The fact that you're able to immune slows, you can chase her down. But let's be honest, the biggest portion of Hebo that makes him shine is the fact that he can just straight up delete people half the time as well. You hit to late game, whether you're running him in mid, whether you're running him in the jungle right now, you're going to see him have a just huge portion of damage in the middle of a team fight. A good ult, a good knock up, no matter what you bring, I think Hebo really does hit every mark you want, either from a mid laner or a jungler.
I think it also gives a bit more flexibility too, if I'm honest, because with Hebo being available now, obviously against Nemesis he's great, but the other thing that Hebo's really doing here, it's allowing you to maybe run a Hunter in mid lane a little bit more, right? It's allowing you to have a bit of a magical damage, so if you do end up running a physical support, for example, you're still balancing your book, so to speak, with your magical damage, but he's very consistent all the way through of what Hebo's going to bring for you. Plus his matchups in the jungle lately aren't that bad.
It's an interesting point as well to bring up those hunters mid. I think that's a pretty good one. And some of the hunters that we've been seeing have really been Cupid early on in these drafts. I've casted for a pretty long time, not quite as long as Hindu Man. this is the first time I can ever remember Cupid being a legitimate top pick ever, and that includes before I was casting.
Yeah, you are right. The only times we've ever seen Cupid was when Jubalonke was meta for a little while, if you remember those days, because everyone worked out that Cupid was good against Jubalonke because you can block the Rising Jaguar, obviously. But I think the buffs that Cupid has received over time has really allowed him to flourish a lot more. Heart Bomb, for example, doing a little bit better at minion clear has helped him out. There's been consistent buffs over time to Cupid. Even the fact his passive no longer doesn't consume his share the love. So his sustain goes way up in these matchups on defense and offense too. But overall, I think Cupid has really started to flourish a lot more. Once upon a time, you'd really only see Cupid as an engaged tool for a lot of teams with that Fields of Love. His playstyle is a little bit different to that of some of the other hunters, but his matchups in the dual lane have been pretty solid overall at the moment. And I guess with the fact you see a lot more people, being forced to take leaps to try and get away from things like Nemesis, but also shut down Nemesis, Cupid sits in that window where the cripple field is a lot more impactful in those team fights. I think we'll see Cupid for a little bit more time to come, even if Nemesis does fall from favor. I still think he's going to be viable, but I do think that we may see a bit of a drop-off with him and Hebo if Nemesis falls down. And with the recent patch notes we've been talking about or just seen lately, you can see that Nemesis might just be starting to teeter.
Real quick, Gormizer, before we move on to our next god, do you think Cupid is overvalued or appropriately valued right now?
I feel like when we see him first pick, that's overvalued in my eyes. I think he's definitely solid and, deserving of the top 6, but I don't know if he's deserving of that number 1 spot every time, especially when you've got, your Nemesis, your Cthulhu, your Mojas, etc. I feel like he's definitely good. His flexibility is really solid. His healing for sieges is great. Fields of Love is an awesome ult. It's hard to list negatives about Cupid right now, but I don't know that he wins me over for at least those top 2.
Fair enough. Another god that's been seeing a lot of top 2 picks, particularly if you're a United player, has been Achilles. And Hindu Man, I mean, this god, you want to talk about flexibility, 3 different roles. He's very, very strong in the SPL level.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, play solo, play the support role, or the jungle. All 3 options are available to Achilles at all times. But I do think that one of the reasons for the rise of Achilles is we saw it before even the buff happened, where we saw his first ability do a little bit more damage now in that cone. It's mainly, if I'm honest, to do with itemization being pretty solid for him overall, but also the ability to get some executes off, to take some of these targets like a Cthulhu, for example, out of the fray. Because don't forget, when Cthulhu's using that ultimate, you get extra protections, but Execute doesn't care how many protections you've got if you can get through that health threshold. So Achilles' rise really happened with Cthulhu coming into the mix and a way to kind of nullify what he brings. But also, I think once he started getting played, people started to realize he's still got a very good impact in the game. Even his passive, to an extent, gives him a bit of flexibility between going for a tankier option versus a little bit more mobile and poke damage as well. Having an Execute in any role is always going to be impactful. His clear options are pretty okay too.
Yeah, chainable execute, by the way. It's not just one. You can execute a whole team.
Good point.
As we've seen before. And one of the most notorious Achilles mains in all of Smite, Belair, Scary D, whatever you want to call him there in the short lane for PK. He sat down recently with John Finch and a couple of his teammates to check in on how the Pittsburgh Knights are doing.
All right, well, what is the easiest role in the game to play? And I've heard a lot of people saying Hunter leading up to this one, but the support?
Yeah, buddy. Yeah. You don't need mechanics.
You need brain power though, and everyone's lacking that. So
you have support mechanics, and that's why you play the role.
Okay, buddy boy. Go tune into my stream and learn a thing or two, man. That's all I'm saying. My Hachiman is clean. It's clean.
What do you think the easiest role is?
I would say probably Hunter, just because, like, I don't know, there's no other role in the game where you just sit there and, like, the game is over and you might not even have done anything, to be honest. Like, honestly, like, sometimes Hunters carry the hell out of games, but also sometimes they're just along for the ride. Like, they've lost the game and all they've done is sit in lane with the other Hunter.
you guys want more of that PK team check-in, which you absolutely should after Ronnie's harsh words for support mains, but I'm joined by 2 support mains for what it's worth. Check it out on the SMITEPro YouTube, just released very recently.
I'm sorry. I need to speak up on that real quick. The solo lane guy that whines about itemization all the time, that needs extra camps added like Tokmaku to keep them busy and relevant in a game, get out of my face. Scary D's about to get camped by all the supports. That's all I'm saying. So PK have already got a strategy there. I think it's pretty wise, but expect to see more supports visit that lane and just let them know, like, we're kind of relevant to an extent. We don't get all this gold in the world and don't get to share lane.
No.
I hate solo laners, man. Idiots. All
Listen,
of them. Every
what do you
single
mean? Your
one.
front line is
Every
together.
one of them now. I hate all of them. No,
All right, well,
not
let's get to
frontliners
the
together.
standings.
No, not having it. Done.
Okay, I'm sorry, Handyman. I'm sorry. Let's get and see what we've got coming into this week. Space Station Gaming, Ghost Gaming, and Radiance all at the top, though one of those teams at least will get to 6 wins just after our first set of the day, because Ghost and Radiance are going to kick us off. And guys, that is our match of the week, and for good reason, because these 2 teams were the finalists at the Phase 1 playoffs. Of course, Ghost did end up coming away with that win. Gore, how do you see this one breaking down? What has changed for these 2 teams?
Man, I think just the whole meta shift as a general for Phase 2 was something Ghost Gaming were on top of almost immediately coming into this phase, and it feels like Radiance still just have the strengths they had. You know, BigManTings maybe has a much wider god pool to be able to pull out, but as a whole, they just keep playing the way they have been. Cyclone Spin has been loving the Cupid pick. It's been working out very well for them on Radiance as well. So they were not even slower to start. They just hit the ground running, and you had kind of mentioned it earlier when you were talking about how things change coming into Phase 2. It's always going to favor these top teams, and I think Ghost were the first team we got to see kind of run away with it, but Radiance love to brawl, and I feel like this meta, especially right now, has kind of opened it up. We see a lot of Warriors over there in support, and Warriors like to fight. If you're going to go over there into the duo lane, you're going to be setting things up. Hercules has been very big, but as we had just talked about, like Achilles even getting some play over there, I think having that Warrior, having him available, is almost favoring both of these teams because of their aggressive play style.
And I can't wait to see how the support matchup's going to break down here, Hindu Man, because PBM versus Aurora, the 2 most storied supports alongside a Raffer in the whole league, it feels like.
Very creative as well, both of them, is what I want to say. But they've also got very similar playstyles to an extent. I think both of them really excel on the aggressive gods, but they have the option to play more defensive. We don't really see that too often out of Aurora, but when we do, it's pretty impactful as well. I think the biggest key going into this set between the 2 is kind of what happened last week. Both of them taking L's, for me, kind of has a knock-on effect on how close I feel this match may go. I mean, honestly, I expected Radiance to fly out of the gate in this one because they're wanting revenge after the mid-season invitational, the big mid-season tournament there where they lose to Ghost. I thought they would come in with a lot of heat, and I still think they will. But I think the difference is with Ghost losing last week, it's time for them to just step it up another gear, you know? So I think they're going to probably fly out the gates early in this one. So I wouldn't be surprised to see fireworks in this game between the 2. But I do think it's going to be a little bit more interesting than I originally expected it to be, because both teams are going to be up for this, passionate to make sure they don't lose 2 in a row, which is, I think, for them, very morale-focused, and something that both teams will be trying to avoid.
It's a really good point that both teams taking a loss last week is going to motivate them coming into this week, though. We asked the chat at the very beginning of the show who they thought was going to win this one. Seems like they feel like it's going to be a little bit more Ghost-favored. 73% of the chat feeling like it's going to be Ghost Gaming, and for good reason. They're the ones who won in the Phase 1 playoffs. Let's see what the whole team of the casting team thinks is going to happen in this set. Do have to give a shout out to John Finch, the only one who's got a B grade, though Gormizer not too far behind. Speaking of behind, Mifflin behind the community, not necessarily what you want to be. Chat, if you guys are fans of Mifflin, and you should be, really good dude, great caster, but don't listen to his predictions. If you really need help and you don't want to listen to any of us, just go into the esports and live streams tab, because you've got a better shot at following those at this point. He went Obey again.
He's never going to get up there, dude.
It doesn't look like it. Wow, we have Ghost sweeping here on Radiance. We got a lot of sweeps
Renegades.
this week.
Chat going Renegades, though. I'm kind of like interested in chat choosing that. Community.
I think it's fair. PK's struggled a little bit so far this phase, and Renegade's coming off a win last week, though PK did dispatch Obey pretty well. And that's one of their matchups against the bottom 4 that we've seen. So hopefully PK, if chat is right, is going to get that win here today. But thanks so much for watching the SPL Waiting Room as per usual. We've got a great matchup to get to. Don't want to keep you waiting here any longer. We'll see you for the SPL all week.